Welcome back to the Wallace Branch, and today we're tackling another fairly big project, the somewhat fictionalized town of Cataldo, Idaho. To start with, we have to add some baseboards to make a little fictional arm of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Now, I'm thinking in the future I could edit this to be more of a river and therefore more prototypical, especially now that I know that steamboats used to come up to Kingston just on the Coeur d'Alene River. In any case, adding these baseboards is necessary to create the edge of the route, and I'm leaving it as a lake for right now. Next, the track layout here is entirely speculative. I just wanted a couple of longer sidings to handle incoming and outgoing trains because this is the edge of the map. Later, I may move these sidings further down to beyond the steamboat dock, in other words, right at the edge of the map. Or I could keep these here and still add those other sidings at the edge of the map. I haven't decided yet. For the dock asset, I decided on just a simple asset along the shoreline and a few small buildings. I like this gray colored dock asset, but it has tracks already on it, so I went with the browner spline type asset. Perhaps that can be reskinned, but it's not something for today. I really like the idea of including some steamboats on the route, even though the high point of steamboat travel on Lake Coeur d'Alene was in the early part of the 20th century, roughly from 1900 to 1920. And even though most steamboat routes went from Coeur d'Alene to Harrison or to St. Mary's, both of them directly on the lake. However, the river was navigable up to Cataldo, and the photo shows that there were occasionally steamboats that went from Coeur d'Alene to Harrison and then upriver to as far as Kingston. Since this is the end of the route, I decided to make a modest dock and have a couple of steamboats moored there. I chose two of the most attractive steamboats to model, the Coeur d'Alene and the Idaho. Here's a little bit about them. And by the way, I used Wikipedia a lot as a reference, not just to what these steamboats looked like, but also to their dimensions. For the Idaho, it was built in 1903 for the Coeur d'Alene and St. Joe Transportation Company. The hull was launched on June 20th, 1903, and it cost $45,000 to build. The Idaho's engines generated 800 horsepower while turning side wheels 22 feet in diameter. The steamer could carry 1,000 passengers, and it was capable of 15 miles per hour. The Idaho made the 48-mile run from Coeur d'Alene City to St. Joe in 3 hours and 10 minutes, including a stop along the way at Harrison. It was operated by the Red Collar Line starting in March 1908. The steamboat caught fire at Black Rock Bay and burned in 1915, when out of service and being used as a warehouse during the apple harvest. As for the Coeur d'Alene, it was a stern-wheeler built in 1883 by Captain Z.J. Hatch of Portland, Oregon, and it was dismantled not too long later, less than 10 years, in 1892. It was 120 feet long and had a 14-foot beam. The Coeur d'Alene made its first trip on April 2, 1884, up the lake from Coeur d'Alene to Kingston, which was past the old mission. Coeur d'Alene was intended to transport ore from the mines of the Coeur d'Alene area, and it proved to be a very lucrative boat, with net earnings sometimes $2,000 per trip. The Coeur d'Alene cost $24,800 to build, and it had a freight rate of $40 per ton, and so it was able to pay for itself after 90 days of operations. It was sold in 1888 to the Northern Pacific Railroad, but abandoned in 1890, with machinery and superstructure being used for the Georgie Oaks. Although I relied on photos and drawings of the steamboats, I also used photos of the steamboat Flyer and also the Georgie Oaks, which, as we just heard, was based on the Coeur d'Alene. And I didn't make the Coeur d'Alene a stern-wheeler. Both the Georgie Oaks and the Coeur d'Alene were stern-wheelers, but I just felt that that might be a little bit beyond me. Growing up, we had an oil painting of the Coeur d'Alene steamboat landing near Cataldo. At least I think that's what my recollection is. It's based on a photo in John Wood's book, Railroads Through the Coeur d'Alenes. I still have the painting in storage. The photo here that I found, it's pretty similar to the one that I remember in that book. I enjoyed modeling these because each steamboat is different, but they do have some similarities. The most noticeable differences are the paddle wheels and then the bridge or pilot house on the top. Where I really struggled with these assets was in importing them into Trainz. And here I'm going to mention another Trainz error that we may have mentioned before, which is namely the problem of messed up normals with concave surfaces. This isn't an error that appears when you drop the asset into the content manager. Instead, just when you look at the asset in game, it appears that some parts of the mesh are invisible. And then when you check back in Blender, the normals are all facing the correct direction. So what's the problem? So next you check maybe the alpha channel or the text file that is created on importing it into Trainz, but those are all fine too. So what's the issue? Unfortunately, it's rather hard to identify, but unpredictably, Trainz has trouble importing perfectly correct meshes that have so-called concave surfaces. If you ask people on Discord or look on the forums, you'll find that most people experience this error when they're doing a locomotive cab or some other interior, or maybe they're making tunnel portals. Those obviously have curved concave surfaces. And the suggested solution that people give is to break up the mesh into multiple objects, and if necessary, separate the parts that are creating the problem. For a complex mesh like the steamboat or the smelter building, where I had the same problem with one of the largest assets in the whole mesh, it can be really hard to isolate what exactly is this concave surface that's causing the issue. For the steamboat, the problem turned out to be the curved deck on the first and second decks. And the solution that I came up with was first to separate every single deck polygon into its own object, and then to extrude them upwards by just a tiny amount, one by one, so that each of those concave surfaces becomes basically totally uneven. And to say the least, that is not a very elegant solution. It took me hours to first identify and then to resolve this problem. It's actually a bug in Trainz. It's not an error code generated by some other software, and it's not user error. So it's super frustrating, especially because there's not a lot out there to help you identify it or to fix the problem. So I don't know if this is helpful advice for anyone, but I sure hope so. The real old mission of the Sacred Heart is located a bit out of town to the west, and it's a state park. It's a beautiful old building. It has a lot of history, and I believe it's the oldest surviving building in Idaho. According to Wikipedia, in the 1840s, the Flathead and Nez Perce peoples sent 6 men east to St. Louis, 4 of whom ultimately arrived, seeking information on Christianity. In 1842, Father Pierre-Jean de Smet responded to the request and came to the area. A mission was established for the area, and the first location chosen for that mission was along the St. Joe River, and that location was found to be subject to flooding, and therefore in 1846 it was decided to move the mission to its current location. In 1850, the church was taken over by the Italian Jesuit missionary Antonio Ravalli, who began designing the new mission building, built by local people using the wattle and daub method, and finished some 3 years later without even using nails. The nearby town is named for Father Giuseppe Cataldo, a Sicilian priest born in the village of Terracini, who spent most of his Jesuit life in the frontier community and actually founded Gonzaga University in Spokane. The interior walls of the mission were decorated with fabric bought from the Hudson's Bay Company and a hand-painted newspaper from Philadelphia that Father Ravalli had received in the mail. Tin cans were used to create the idea of chandeliers. Wooden statues were carved by Father Ravalli himself using a knife, and they were intended to look like marble. The blue coloring of the interior wood is pressed huckleberry stain. According to one history I read, the Northern Pacific's Wallace branch initially started from Cataldo, building eastward towards Lookout and St. Regis. And this is because the land grant did not allow the Northern Pacific itself to build branch lines. The NP had to form subsidiary companies, which then would merge their branch line with the NP after the branch had been completed. The OR&N, which was later the UP, those tracks passed through Cataldo. I wanted the mission to overlook the tracks in the river as it does in this photo of the steamboat, the Amelia Wheaton. The mission became a stop and supply station for traders, settlers, and miners traveling on the Mullen Road and later on the railroad. It was a working port for boats heading up the Coeur d'Alene River. Next, it's time to plop down the actual old mission asset. I'm lining it up with the tracks, even though they probably weren't aligned in reality, but it looks nicer this way. The old mission is actually the headquarters of the Trail of the Coeur d'Alenes that follows the UP and the NP right-of-ways, so it's appropriate to have it on this map. And of course, like any town, we need some hand-laid roads and handmade bridge asset. Next, it's time to add some houses for the town. Even though the actual town of Cataldo is some ways off from the state park, I decided to put the two together. And although the house assets I used are just the same ones I've been using across the map, I still did look at the town of Harrison as a reference. It looks like Harrison has some nice little cafes and restaurants and some bungalows to stay in for Airbnbs. The old mission is a state park, so I added a nice historical marker and people reading it or studying it, and also a tourist bus and some sheep to keep the grass short. I always like the idea of having a waterside cafe and a recreational dock with people fishing and boating. And who doesn't like putting down boats in this game? It's great that the DLS has some static assets of people fishing. I decided to put in the highway up the river a bit to Enneville, and here I'm putting in a few farms and buildings along the route to Enneville just to fill in the background. For most of the route, I've been doing this sort of filling space off camera, so here I'm just giving you a taste of how the scrapbook assets work, although we've already seen the scrapbook assets technique for filling in towns. And there we have it, the old mission and a town of Cataldo mostly done, although with the caveat that there might be additional tracks continuing to the edge of the map to represent staging for off-map trains. So that basically does it for the map west of Wallace. But don't despair, there's more to come. The main task ahead is the huge mining district of Burke, Idaho. In the next episode, we'll be looking at some of the mining areas of the Burke Branch, and especially the Mammoth Standard Mine and Mill. So if you enjoyed it, feel free to like and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time on the Wallace Branch.